Romans restored the Epistle of the Inner Light by Bishop Raymond Taylor, Ph.D. The book of Romans is the key to the entire New Testament, and the key to exposing its redaction is the hinge upon which the entire Christian theology turns. Once you open it, strip out the edits, and see what it really was, you will understand everything that happened. Romans was a philosophical and spiritual backbone of a much older current of faith, the faith of the Mandaeans. Before the priests of Rome and the temple cult corrupted it with their blood, their fear, and their politics. This so-called Apostle Paul was not a Pharisee. That was an invention added to make him credible within rabbinical Judaism. He never studied under Gamaliel, nor was he a legalist. He was a Mandaean initiate. The writers of Acts needed a character who could bridge Jewish and Gentile worlds, so they created this character of a Pharisee turned convert. The real Paul was not a prosecutor of Christians because there were no Christians yet. He was a man of the way, a Nasoraean of the great life who taught renewal through water and spirit, not through the sacrifice of blood. Paul says he was from Tarsus, but Tarsus in Aramaic means basket or vessel. It carries the idea of containment, a place that holds something sacred. In other words, it is not necessarily a city. It may be a symbolic of initiation itself, a vessel for knowledge, just as the redactors invented the city of Nazareth to hide the word Nasoraean. They likely invented Taurus as a geographical cover for a spiritual title. The Nasoraeans were the early Mandaeans, the keepers of the secret light. They lived by rivers and guarded the baptismal current. Jesus was one of them, and so was Paul. The later editors created the story of Nazareth. They needed a hometown for Jesus that fit their invented prophecy. No record of Nazareth exists from the first century. Archaeology has never produced evidence of that functioning town in that period. What they call ruins are later Byzantine structures. The real word for Nasorea, meaning those who guard the secret of light. They erased the Nasoreans by turning them into residents of a fictional town. The same thing happened with Magdala. The word means tower or place of water, not a proper name. Mary Magdalene simply means Mary of the tower, Mary of the water. She too was Mandaean. Every genuine follower of the river was written as a Jew of the temple cult. Every river scene became theater, every baptism superstition. Nowhere is the writing clearer than in the book of Romans. When you read it carefully, you can see the joins. Chapter 9 through 11 were later insertions meant to reconcile Paul with Judaism. The entire discussion of Israel, election, and Abraham is artificial. Remove those chapters, and the text flows seamlessly. From chapter 8 to 12, the interruptions vanish and the original voice returns. Let us reconstruct Romans from the beginning. Romans 1 and 2 speak of the inner law. Once you remove these constant references to Torah and Hebrew prophets, what remains is a description of conscience. The writer says that people know the truth by the light within, that they suppress this truth through ignorance and fear. That is not Jewish thought. That is Mandaean. It is close to Stoic philosophy also. The real writers of Romans taught that every person carries the spark of the divine within themselves. The later editors replaced that with the concept of obedience to a written law. Romans 3 and 4, in their original form, argue that purification does not come from rituals or sacrifice, but from faithfulness to truth. The word faith here did not mean belief in dogma. It means trust in the living current of truth. The redactors inserted blood and redemption to align with temple imagery, but the original sense was alignment with the light. The source of this lies in the Ginza Rabbah, which says that those who keep truth and righteousness are cleansed through the living water, not through offerings. Romans 5 was turned into myth about Adam and Christ in the original layer. it was meditation on ignorance and awakening. Humanity falls into error not through sin, but through forgetfulness. The return to awareness brings life. Later editors inserted the false doctrine of original sin and replaced awakening with atonement. The entire economy of blood was born from that single lie. Romans 6 through 8 contain the heart of the original teaching. The genuine writer spoke of dying to ignorance and rising to awareness through immersion. We die with him in baptism was not about crucifixion, but about transformation. Baptism was symbolic death, renewal in the river of light. Every Mandaean baptism echoes the same formula. The redactors turned that into crucifixion, myth, making Paul sound like a theologian of blood, but he was speaking of water, not blood. He was describing the spiritual renewal of the soul through knowledge and conscience, not sacrifice and superstition. Romans 9 through 11, as mentioned, are complete insertions. They have no connection to the flow of the text. They were added to turn Paul into a defender of Israel and the prophets. They contradict everything he said earlier. Once removed, the letters regain coherence. The argument is not about law, lineage, or election. It is about universal light and rebirth of the soul. Romans 12 through 15 form an ethical code. The redactors layered in lines about living sacrifice and Old Testament references, but the original meaning was simple. Dedicate your life to truth, live justly, do not repay evil with evil, transform the mind daily. These are not Judaic ideas. They are Mandaean and Stoic. The authentic voice of Paul was not preaching temple ritual, but personal integrity. Romans 16 closes with names of the followers of the way. None are Jerusalem priests or Pharisees. They are Greek, Syrian, and Aramaic names, tied to the wider river communities. This is the network of Nasoraeans, the same group later demonized by the church as heretics and Gnostics. The forgery becomes clear when you compare the themes. The original Romans taught illumination through the inner light. The edited version teaches obedience through blood. The authentic voice points to conscience and rebirth through truth. The counterfeit points to submission to institutions. Paul's real identity reveals why the editors worked so hard to bury him under Jewish and Roman myth. If Paul was a Nasoraean, he was part of the same Mandaean line as John and Jesus. He would have been baptized not into the death of Christ, but into the great life. He would have rejected blood sacrifice as vile superstition. His statement that he dies daily refers to the Mandaean practice of daily renewal immersion and confession in living water that is found in the Ginza Rabbah, section Rite 46, where the initiate declares, "I die daily to the world of darkness and rise again in the light." The so-called Saul of Tarsus is likely a literary corruption of Simon or another river teacher. Acts merges several figures into one to build the illusion of a church founder. The claim that he persecuted Christians is nonsense because there were no Christians to persecute. The entire narrative was fabricated by the Proto-Orthodox Church to give themselves an apostolic origin. The Church Fathers invented Paul as a bridge between their Romanized doctrine and the original river sect. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, the redacted Paul became the perfect figurehead for the new Roman religion. The empire adopted the theology of blood and obedience, suppressing the gospel of water and truth. The Catholic Church was born out of that lie. It is a product of Rome and the temple cult, two systems that thrive on guilt and control. Both are antithetical to the great life. The sources exposing this redaction are consistent. The Ginza Rabbah, translated by E.S. Drower, preserves the concept of rebirth through water, not through sacrifice. Josephus in Antiquities 18.5.2 confirms John's baptismal movement outside temple authority. The Peshitta, the Syriac version of Romans, shows linguistic inconsistencies where Jewish interpolations were added. Modern textual critics such as Bruno Bauer and Robert Price have already shown that Romans 9 through 11 are late additions. Archaeological evidence for Nazareth in the 1st century remains non-existent. The etymology of Magdala and Tarsus supports symbolic rather than geographical meanings. All of these converge on one conclusion. The authentic current of the New Testament was not Jewish and not Roman. It was Mandaean. It was a river faith of the water and light. The book of Romans, in its restored form, is no longer an argument for obedience. It is a manual of awakening. It teaches that the divine speaks through conscience, that purity comes from the living water, that the truth is the only offering worth giving. The Proto-Orthodox Church turned it into propaganda for submission and blood, a grotesque parody of its original beauty. When we redact the redactors, we strip away the interpolations, the false prophecies, the invented cities, and the fabricated saints. What remains is pure. Paul was not a Pharisee. He was a Mandaean teacher of the great life. Jesus was not from Nazareth. He was a Nasoraean of the living current. Mary was not from a seaside town. She was from the tower of water. Every river, every immersion, every act of truth was rewritten to please Rome and to feed the temple demon. They still survive today. The same demon still thirsts for blood. It builds walls, wages war, and calls them holy. But it cannot win. The great life cannot be conquered. The river still flows, and the light still shines through every forgery they wrote. The real Paul, the real Jesus, and the real John are alive in that current. To find them, you must go back to the water, not to the altar. You must wash away the lies of Rome and the fear of Yahweh. You must see that the true baptism is not of fire, not of blood, but of truth. The river of the Romans still runs beneath the rubble of empire. Listen to it, and you will hear the voice that said, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind, not for the God of violence, not for the temple demon, but for the great life that has no name and no need for blood. Veritas lux mea. The truth is my light."